Man, it's a cool, brisk Mother's Day this morning. Want to let all you moms know that we love you. Thank you so much for all that you do. I've been especially thinking about my mom this week, and I even put, Mom, and I'm sorry, I talked about you in my bulletin article this morning, talking about you doing your Irish jig, and so I'm looking forward to seeing that, and so are the grandkids next time we get together. But it is good to see you this morning. I tell you, gang, we miss being together. Miss ya. Love you, and can't wait for us to get back together again. It looks like it's going to be coming up sometime soon. So we'll see about that. Meanwhile, we'll do the best that we can with the format that we have going on this morning. We've been in Hebrews, and Jay took chapter 9 last week. We're going to be jumping into chapter 10 this week. Man, what a study this has been. Every week it's just more and more, and it just gets better and better. And so we're going to be jumping into chapter 10 here this morning. There's going to be a big transition right smack in the middle of chapter 10. We'll talk about that here in just a moment, but we'll get to that here. Verse 1 really launches us into the study. So here's kind of what's going on when we come to chapter 10. Again, there's a big transition there. He's been talking about the superiority of Jesus since the beginning. He's better than the angels, better than Moses, better than the high priest, and then he jumps into the sacrificial system, and he's better than the animal sacrifices that Jay talked about last week. And now he's going to talk about the difference between the repetitious sacrifices of the Levitical priest and the one time and for all sacrifice of Jesus. All right? Verse 1 of chapter 10, let's jump into there. It's perfect and it is so meaty. So let's jump into there and read this together. I'm reading out of the New American Standard. For the law, since it has only a shadow of the good things to come, and not the very form of the things, can never, by the same sacrifices year by year, which they offer continually, make perfect those who draw near. Now there's so much stuff in there, we could just totally hunker down on verse 1 and just stay there for the rest of our time together. We're not going to do that. We're going to try to actually cover some material today. That very last phrase has been the key phrase, I think is the key phrase of everything that the writer of Hebrews has been saying since the very first verse of the very first chapter. He wants us to be able to draw near to God. And so this is what I want you to do. Just imagine this. I'm a very visual person. I want you to write up at the top of your TV screen, or just at the top of your picture of your frame of your mind, draw near to God, and draw a big circle around it. Draw near to God. That's the ultimate goal in everything that he's saying. So that's going to kind of be the filter through which we read this. We're going to be, in my lingo, in my study terms, I'm banging everything off of that phrase. I'm pushing everything through that phrase. Whatever truths the author is saying here, it's going through this idea that it is meant to draw people closer to God. So look at what verse 1 is saying. All right, look at this. Let's read this again. The first part of verse 1. For the law, since it has only a shadow of the good things to come, and not the very form of things, can never by the same sacrifices year after year make perfect those who draw near. The old covenant, the old law, the old way is never going to do it. It's never going to draw you near to God, right? And so there needs to be something else. And that's what the author's been talking about now for several weeks and for several chapters. Only Jesus can provide that. So he also introduces a couple of key phrases here. He says right there in the middle, can never by the same sacrifices year after year. All right, so this is what's happening. They're offering the sacrifices, they're burning them to God. Maybe it's the Day of Atonement, maybe it's going on different days. But he's saying this repetitious offering is not doing it. We need something else. All right? We talked about a couple of weeks ago about how the Old Covenant and this new covenant are completely different. The old covenant here, according to verse 1, is repetition, repetition. You got to keep on doing it, got to keep on doing it, kind of keep on doing it. And the new covenant with Jesus comes in and says, it's got to be different. I'm going to do it once, and it's going to be for all time. All right? So let's put this now in context, and let's read a couple of more verses with this in mind. Okay? Let's, again, read verse 1, I think is one of the key verses here. There's several. In 39 verses, there's about 4 or 5, and maybe we'll get to them today, I don't know. But let's read 2 or 3 verses now. Let's read this again. For the law, since it has only a shadow of the good things to come, and not the very form of things, can never by the same sacrifices year after year, which they offer continually, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise, they would not have ceased to be offered, because the worshipers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have had consciousness of sin. In other words, guilt, shame, right, all that sort of stuff, right? But look at verse 3. But in those sacrifices there is a reminder of the sins year after year, for it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. All right? So let's kind of pull this together. If these first 18 verses kind of sum up, they introduce this idea of once and for all, but they also sum up everything the author's kind of been saying. There in verse 19, big transition to application. Okay? It seems to be saying here, the author seems to be saying this. And if I were to put a summary statement on the past 10 and a half chapters, it would be this: the old covenant needs Christ. Or the old covenant didn't have Christ, and that is the difference. Now, I know we're here, we've got a little bit limited of time. For the time that we've been in classes, I've been saying, hey, stop the video, wrestle, meditate, pray, study, research, whatever you got to do. I would make that one of these times right here. When you think about not having Christ, that being the key difference, I'd love for us just to stop, just to hunker down on this idea and to pray about this, to meditate on it, to wrestle with it, to really take it in and really soak it down deep into our hearts and really see the impact that Christ and only Christ has had on our lives. That has been probably the number one point. Jesus offers something that none of these other things can offer. Nothing. What difference has Christ made in your life? That's where I would like for us just to stop, just to pray, just to meditate on. What if we did that daily? What if we just took 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes and said, Jesus, man, I couldn't be here without you. You know what I'm saying? What a difference that makes. And so here he is just giving piece of evidence, just about saying Christ is the difference maker. So you can kind of see the problem that he's kind of been pounding on. Why would I go back to the old way? Why would I go back to the old way? Church, why are you going back to old things? Don't let go of Jesus. He offers you something that no one else does. Let's read on in the text. I want you to take a little mental note. If I've got my whiteboard up here, I'm writing the word will. W-I-L-L. So in your mind, I want you to picture this word will, all right? Draw near to God, all right? That's at the top, and now we've got the word will on there. I think that's vital when we start taking a look at the next little section of text, okay? All right. Let's take a look at this. Let's start reading in verse 4, and we're going to probably go all the way down to verse 10. All right, so let's take a look at this. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Therefore, when he comes into the world, he says, now this is kind of interesting. The author is writing to this Hebrew church, but he's writing as if Jesus is having a conversation with God. Okay? Therefore, when he, Jesus, comes into the world, he, Jesus, says, sacrifice and offerings thou hast not desired, thou being God. Okay, again, I'm reading out of the NAS. It's got a lot of these and thous in it, all right? Sacrifice and offering thou hast not desired, but a body thou hast prepared for me. Can you see Jesus saying these things to God? These bulls and these sacrifices and this blood hasn't been enough. You desire a body, and so there's kind of this underlying question, who will then offer it? Who's going to do this thing that you desire, that you need? All right, that's kind of the question that Jesus is kind of posing there. Verse 6 says, in whole burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin, thou hast taken no pleasure. But check out verse 7. Big punch here, big punch. Then I said, that's Jesus, then I said, behold, I have come, in the roll of the book it is written of me, to do thy will, O God. If you don't mind underlining or highlighting or boxing or doing whatever, underline that phrase, I've come to do thy will. That's important. Verse 8, after saying above, sacrifices and offerings and whole burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin thou hast not desired, nor hast thou taken pleasure in them, which are offered according to the law. Then he said, behold, I have come to do thy will. Remember, that word will was the word we kind of wanted to concentrate on here for just a moment. He takes away the first in order to establish the second. By this will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. All these sacrifices, year after year after year, wasn't cutting it. That's not what God desired. He desired a one-time sacrifice, a body for all. And Jesus stands up and he says, what's our word? I will. I will. I'll do it. I'll be the sacrifice, right? There's that song I love to sing, the Lord has a will and I have a need. Y'all know that song, right? So there's two kinds of will going on right here in this text. There's the will of God, right? One of the things we could have talked about earlier, and I believe I mentioned maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, that there seem to be 3 promises. 3 promises that kind of rise to the top. There's lots of promises of God in the text. But there seem to be 3 that kind of rise to the top. Forgiveness of sins, hope of eternal life, and that I'm always going to be there with you. Jesus and God are always going to be there. Those seem to be this 3. And so here is God's will that we be saved, that we get to heaven, that we have forgiveness. But these bulls and goats are just not cutting it. I need a body sacrifice. And Jesus says, I will. I'll offer that sacrifice. The Lord has a will, and so let's kind of put this together. The Lord has a will. Jesus says twice now, verse 7, I have come to do thy will. And then down in verse 10, by this will. All right? I've come to do thy will. I'm going to match my will, my desires, my thoughts, my actions to yours, God. And it's because of this will, look at verse 10 again, because of this will that we become sanctified. Nice big fat biblical word. Simply means that we've been cleansed. Right? Now, let me take a little bit step sideways. When we introduce the word holy, right? God is holy, therefore He cannot be around sin. The only way we're going to get close to God then is if we are cleansed. Sanctified means we are cleansed to be able to, what's the phrase at the top of our screen? Draw near. I've been cleansed to draw near. So let's put this whole package together. The Lord has a will. He said, I've got a need. I've got these promises. I want you. Jesus said, I will. I'll do it. I'll offer the one sacrifice for all time, for all people in all places, so that people can be cleansed enough to be able to draw near. The very thing that all those sacrifices year after year could not do. All right? I want us to kind of concentrate then again, take a little time and think about this word will. Jesus' choice, and it is a choice. Jesus' choice to be a sacrifice. You see, I believe will has two things to it, all right? I believe it has the intellectual part. I understand what you're saying. And then it also has an action part to it. Take a look at the second part of verse 7. Then I said, behold, I have come to do the will of God. Right? So there's this action piece. Jesus says, I understand your will, and I'm going to totally be a part of it. All right? So here's what the author is doing, I believe. I believe he's setting up this situation, this story, this little piece of Jesus as not only a summation of everything he's talked about, but also a launching point for the rest of the book. The rest of the book is, so what do we do with the first part? How do we apply it? Here's what we've kind of understood as the intellectual part, the first 10 chapters, but now here's the to-do part. And I believe he's showing kind of Jesus here as an example. So we've got God's will, Jesus deciding to do God's will, and the author is encouraging the church. Let's simply follow Jesus' example to do God's will. Are y'all following with me on that one? I hope you see that. All right? Starting now in verse 19, he begins to explain this whole to-do part. And we'll get to that in just a minute. I wanted us to look at verse 18 real quickly. A couple of weeks ago, I talked about the 1-2 punch of different scriptures in there. I believe this is another one. Verse 18, man, I could spend some time on this one, and I hope that you do. Again, there's so much in this text that we just kind of can't get it all and flesh it out. That's why I encourage you to study and to wrestle with this on your own. This one-time sacrifice offers forgiveness. All right, forgiveness. Now again, reflecting back on a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And back there in chapter, I believe it was chapter 8, if you don't mind going back there, he says, hey, let me tell you about what's going to happen when the new covenant comes. And he starts listing some things. It's going to be in your heart instead of something physical, right? But he also says in verse 12 something pretty impactful that I believe attaches us, that links back to verse 18. He says this about the new covenant in verse 12 of chapter 8. For I will be merciful to their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more. All right? So we turn back to chapter 10, verse 18. Jesus, I'll do your will, Lord. I'll match my will to your will. I'll be the sacrifice. Once and for all, I will sanctify all the people, and that will bring them forgiveness of sins. All right? So let's look at verse 18. Now, where there is forgiveness of these sins, there is no longer any offering for sin. There seems to be a trick, I believe, of Satan to hold us in our sin, in our guilt, in our shame. All right? The effect sometimes of sin and guilt and shame is, well, if I'm not If I'm not good enough, why should I even try? And so I'll stop trying, or I won't try as hard. And you can see how someone might start actually to drift away, right? So I believe Satan's been using this tactic for years and years and years and years. So let's think back just a minute to what's happening contextually, right? We've got a group of Christians who have known Christ. They've been saved. They've been doing some great things. The chapter will later tell us they've been doing some great things, but they have started drifting away. The text doesn't come out and say, but you can almost see how if they start drifting away, start looking at other things and start letting go of Christ, who is the only one who can really offer sins, you can see how this sin and this shame, guilt builds and builds and builds and becomes bigger than Christ's act on the cross. And it can take us away from Christ. Does that ever happen to you? Have you ever had moments when you let sin just build up and shame build up from past missteps, past sins? I tell you guys, one of the big punches from this text is this: God has forgotten those. Why haven't you? That is huge in the text. That is a big point. One of the things that can hold us back, keep us from moving forward, cause us to let go, which is our theme for the whole book, is don't let go. Can cause us to let go is that we see these other things as too much, and God's sacrifice, and Jesus' sacrifice, is not enough. And I like what verse 8 is kind of teaching for us today. When God has said, I've forgiven them, they've been forgiven. Let it go. Let it go, man. Don't let that keep you from staying firm, from keeping your eyes on Christ, right? That's hard, though, isn't it, sometimes? That's why I believe He tells us to do some things. To be encouraged, to continue to meet together. Let's look at these next set of verses. And it kind of gives us some to-do things to help us to hold on to Christ, to remember Him. Right? So let's take a look at verses 19 through 25. In those scriptures, there are 5 things that it tells us to do or to remember or to think about that help us to remember Christ once for all sacrifice for sins. All right? So let's take a look at this. We'll read these. You see if you can catch them coming. Usually they start with the phrase, let us. All right? Let us. All right? Please remember our filter at the top of the page, at the top of our screen. All this is to draw near. That's what we're trying to do, is draw near. All right? So let's read, starting in verse 19. Since, therefore, dramatic change in the text, no longer kind of doing instruction and doctrine, and I'm now changing to application. Big change in the book, all right? Since, therefore, brethren, we have confidence to enter the holy place of the blood of Jesus. Entering the holy place, drawing near to God. Boom. Since we now have that, now let's do this so that we can hold on, so that we can keep this thing going, so that we can move sin aside and really take that forgiveness and believe it. Right? I notice in the NAS it has that word confidence. I've got confidence in the cross. I've got confidence in that promise that says your sins will be forgiven. So I'm letting it go, I'm pushing it aside, and I'm moving on, right? All right. Since therefore, brethren, we have confidence to enter the holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way which He inaugurated for us through the veil that is His flesh. He's making a reference there. You remember when Jesus died on the cross? Some things happened in the weather and the veil was torn. Symbolically, Jesus' body was torn right? That's kind of what's going on there when it says His flesh. It was inaugurated for us through the veil, that is, His flesh. And since we have a great high priest over the house of God, let us, here he goes, here's the first of the 5, let us draw near. Come on in close. Don't stay away. Let us draw near with a sincere heart in full assurance of faith, having a heart sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Verse 23, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for He who promised is faithful. A couple of chapters ago, he said, let God's character, let God's nature be an anchor for our soul so that we don't drift, but that we stay with Him. And so here he is again talking about this idea of hope, right? Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for He who promised is faithful. What 3 promises? What promises? He's always going to forgive my sins. I've got hope of eternal salvation. He's always going to be with me. Those promises, that's what he's talking about. Let's go up to verse 24. Here's the third one. And let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds. And, you could put in parentheses, let us, not forsaking our own assembling together, as is the habit of some, but, and again in parentheses, let us encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. So how do I live this out, gang? How do I do this? And so he's kind of given us some examples. You notice those first couple are the internal, the confidence. I'm taking this in, but the last 2 or 3 are totally the to-do, the action, just like Jesus' will. Just like Jesus' will included action. All right. I notice that our time is starting to slip away from us. I want us to go ahead then and drop down to verse 32. There's something pretty impactful there that I wanted us to take notice of. Let's start reading there in verse 32. But remember the former days, when, after being enlightened, you endured a great conflict of suffering, partly by being made a public spectacle through reproaches and tribulations, and partly by becoming sharers with those who were so treated. For you showed sympathy to the prisoners. If we wanted to add on some things that they're doing because of their confidence of drawing near to God, because of their forgiveness, because of being sanctified, here's some other things that they were doing. For you showed sympathy to the prisoners and accepted joyfully the seizure of your property, knowing that you have for yourselves a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, when you've taken it in intellectually and you've started to do it physically, right? When you've done the will of God, you may have received what was promised. What's been promised, gang? That's the next natural question. Why are you asking me to persevere? Why are you asking me to endure? Because you have promises. Promises of forgiveness of sins. The hope that someday, man, this thing is all going to be over and I'm going to be in heaven, which is a far better place. The promise that Jesus and God are always going to be with me, always going to have my back, always support me. And here's what kind of solidifies that idea. Where is Jesus sitting at this moment, according to the text? He's at the right hand of God. And He's telling God everything about you, supporting you, encouraging you. He's done this great work of sanctification for you. Don't let go. Guys, I hope that's been encouraging to you. Thanks for taking a few moments out this morning. Hey, pray about this, meditate on it, Wrestle with it. Really make it your own faith, and I think it'll make a huge difference. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.